Hello everyone, and welcome to my CBS BNB Full Today channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The Forrester family had always believed that no matter how violent the storm, the foundation beneath them would hold. Decades of power, fashion, fidelity, and precisely guarded secrets had shaped their dynasty into commodity that sounded unbreakable from the outside. Yet history had proven time and again that the most dangerous pitfalls didn't arrive through boardroom appropriations or rival fashion houses, but through pedigrees still assumed to be true. On this day, the verity didn't creep in gently. It arrived like an earthquake, shattering individualities, rewriting family history, and leaving behind emotional wreckage no couture conglomerate could conceal. For months, an uneasy pressure had floated over Los Angeles, particularly around Forrester creations. The pressure didn't stem from fiscal insecurity or creative failure, but from commodity far more intimate. Old connections were being redefined, past choices resurfaced, and undetermined connections refused to stay buried. At the center of this growing discomfort stood Deacon Sharp, a man long treated as a supplemental figure in the Forrester route, permitted at best, doubted at worst. Deacon had always was in the perimeters of power, but perimeters frequently offered the clearest view of the verity. What no bone anticipated was that Deacon had been sitting on information able of dismembering the veritably core of the Forrester heritage. The disclosure didn't come from malignancy or vengeance, at least not entirely. It came from a quiet preoccupation with the history, a need to eventually understand events that had no way relatively added up. Deacon had spent times replaying old moments in his mind, questioning timelines, emotional responses, and subtle inconsistencies that others had dismissed. What began as private curiosity converted into commodity necessary when wisdom handed answers that memory no way could. A DNA test, conducted discreetly and vindicated constantly, told a story radically different from the bone. The Forresters had erected their lives around. The results were inarguable. A child long believed to be a true Forrester by blood wasn't biologically connected to the family primogeniture at all. The impact of that verity spread presto and mercilessly, indeed before the full details came public. Emotional fractures appeared incontinently. Connections formerly defined by certainty were suddenly exposed as fragile constructs erected on hypotheticals. Love that had felt unconditional now carried vacillation. Pride turned into confusion, and fidelity came involved with treason. The Forrester name, formerly synonymous with prestige and permanence, now felt dangerously unstable. Cleric's part in this unraveling was insolvable to ignore. Though he hadn't finagled the original deception, he came the runner of destruction, the man who refused to keep silent any longer. His decision to reveal the verity wasn't made smoothly. He understood exactly what would be lost once the secret escaped constraint. Entire individualities would collapse. Maternal bonds would be questioned. Generations would be forced to defy the possibility that they had been living a taradiddle. The most ruinous consequence of the DNA stunner wasn't the natural verity itself, but what it represented. The Forrester family had always placed enormous value on lineage, blood, and heritage. Their power structure depended on it. To discover that this foundation was defective felt like an empirical threat. However, what differently had been wrong? What other trueness had been excessively ignored in favor of comfort? If blood could be misattributed for so long? As the reality settled in, feelings entwined out of control. Shock gave way to wrathfulness, wrathfulness to grief, and grief to a suffocating sense of treason. The family plotted to attune times of participated recollections with a verity that now cast those recollections in a different light. Moments formerly cherished felt alloyed. Fests flashed back with pride now carried in turnabout of falsehood. The history couldn't be rewritten, but its meaning had been irrevocably altered. The maternal figure at the center of the disclosure faced a reckoning unlike anything ahead. Times of guidance, discipline, love, and immolation were suddenly questioned by biology, indeed though emotionally they remained real. The mind plotted to accept that devotion could attend with deception. The heart defied the idea that blood alone defined family. Yet the sting of being misled refused to fade. Trust, formerly broken at this position, didn't fluently repair itself. Meanwhile, the child at the center of the storm endured an extremity of identity so profound that it reshaped their entire sense of tone. A continuance of believing in a certain heritage had been stripped down in a moment. Questions multiplied endlessly. Who am I, if not who I was told I am? Where do I truly belong? Was love given freely, or was it tentative on a taradiddle? These questions echoed relentlessly, offering no immediate comfort. Cleric, though braced for counter-reaction, undervalued the emotional desolation his disclosure would beget. Being right didn't feel victorious. It felt heavy. He watched the fallout with an admixture of grim resoluteness and quiet remorse. He'd always was outside the Forrester circle, but now he was ever etched into their history as the man who cracked it open. Whether he'd be flashed back as a verity teller or a destroyer remained uncertain. As word of the DNA stunner spread, alliances shifted fleetly. Some family members cleaved to emotional bonds, averring that love overbalanced genetics. Others felt irreparably deceived, unfit to separate affection from the treason that had defined it. Long-standing battles boosted, while unanticipated connections formed in the participated wreckage. The family home, once a sanctuary, came a battleground of implied allegations and silent grief. The disclosure also carried dangerous counteraccusations for the future of Forrester Creations itself. However, race plans came unstable if pedigrees were questioned. Power dynamics quivered. Boardroom confidence gave way to rumored enterprise. Challengers tasted vulnerability, while interposers stressed that the reproach would permanently stain the brand. The Forrester name had survived dishonors ahead, but this one struck at commodity far deeper than public image. At its core, the extremity forced everyone involved to defy an uncomfortable verity about family itself. Biology, while important, wasn't the sole determinant of love, fidelity, or belonging. Yet ignoring biology entirely felt dishonest. The Forresters set up themselves trapped between emotional reality and factual verity, unfit to completely embrace one without immolating the other. The silence that followed the disclosure was maybe the most satisfying consequence of all. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but one filled with mourning for an interpretation of life that no longer was. Exchanges came careful. Ganders carried dubitation. Indeed, moments of tender-heartedness felt conditional, as though everyone stressed stepping on emotional landmines. For Cleric, the future remained uncertain. His part in exposing the verity didn't guarantee redemption or acceptance. He'd forced honesty into a family erected on picky memory, and the cost of that honesty was immense. Yet despite the chaos, the verity couldn't be undone. It was now endless and unrecoverable. The Forrester family, formerly defined by certainty, now stood at a crossroads. They could allow the DNA disclosure to destroy them fully, or they could review what family meant in the fate of verity. Either path needed courage. Either path demanded pain. The old Forrester dynasty was gone, replaced by commodity fractured and fragile, but maybe more honest than ever ahead. What remained to be seen was whether honesty alone would be enough to save what was left. The days following the DNA disclosure unfolded with a strange, nearly suffocating stillness. The kind of silence that didn't gesture peace, but rather the moment after impact, when everyone was still trying to understand how important damage had truly been done. The Forrester estate, formerly alive with movement and confidence, felt hollowed out, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the emotional shock. Every hallway carried echoes of exchanges that no longer felt safe to have. Every room felt like a memorial of a history that couldn't be trusted. The weight of the verity pressed down on each member of the family else. Some carried it like a particular failure, others like an insupportable treason foisted upon them. What united them was the consummation that nothing they believed about their family structure was guaranteed presently. The certainty that had formerly defined them had dissolved into mistrustfulness, and mistrustfulness was a far more dangerous adversary than any rival fashion house could ever be. The emotional center of the extremity continued to widen. What had begun as a single disclosure expanded into a broader reckoning with history itself. Once connections were redefined with ruthless scrutiny. Old opinions that had formerly sounded insignificant were now deconstructed for retired meaning. Memories that formerly brought comfort now inspired dubitation. The once no longer felt like a participated story, but a precisely edited interpretation of events designed to cover reports rather than people. The individual revealed by the DNA test set up themselves insulated in a way that couldn't be fluently articulated. Girdled by familiar faces, yet suddenly feeling like a stranger, they plotted to attune the love they had entered with the natural verity that contradicted it. Every gesture of affection now carried an implied question. Was this love real, or was it simply habit? The cerebral risk of that query began to manifest in subtle ways, from emotional pullout to moments of quiet despair that went unnoticed by those too consumed by their own pain. Meanwhile, the maternal figure who had intentionally lived a taradiddle faced an extremity of identity just as profound. Parenting had been a foundation of their actuality, a part embraced completely and passionately. To learn that biology had been absent from that bond felt like a cruel twist of fate. Yet the emotional connection remained inarguable, creating a painful contradiction. Love didn't evaporate simply because blood ties were disproven, but trust had been shattered, and rebuilding it sounded nearly insolvable. The treason felt deeply particular, not only because of the deception itself but because of its duration. Times had passed under false pretenses. Life-changing opinions had been made grounded on an assumed verity that no way was. The consummation that concurrence had been intentionally violated, that a life had been shaped by misinformation, touched off a rage that coddled just beneath the face, hanging to erupt at any moment. Deacon Sharp, despite having delivered the verity, set up himself trapped in a moral Argentine area. His conduct were embedded in honesty, yet the desolation they caused made it delicate for anyone to view him as anything other than a catalyst for destruction. He came a lightning rod for wrathfulness, resentment, and lost blame. The family's grief demanded a target, and Deacon was the most accessible bone. His long-standing stranger status made it easy to dismiss his intentions, anyhow of their legality. At the same time, Cleric himself was forced to defy the consequences of his decision in ways he hadn't anticipated. Watching the fallout unfold didn't bring satisfaction. It brought an inviting sense of responsibility. The verity, formerly revealed, had an instigation of its own, and Cleric couldn't control where it landed or who it crushed along the way. He'd pulled a thread that unraveled an entire shade, and there was no way to weave it back together. The ripple goods extended beyond the family, and into the professional world they dominated. Forrester Creations, a brand erected on image, heritage, and heritage, now faced an empirical extremity. Tales began circulating within the company, fueled by leaks and enterprise. Workers tasted insecurity at the top, and insecurity bred fear. Fear led to miscalculations, and miscalculations hovered the character the company had spent decades cultivating. Boardroom dynamics shifted fleetly. Authority that formerly went unquestioned now felt fragile. Opinions were second-guessed. Confidence eroded. The DNA disclosure had introduced an element of unpredictability that no bone was prepared to manage. Investors began to worry about race. Challengers still celebrated the cracks appearing in a conglomerate they had long plotted to compete. Within the family, coalitions began to form. Some members cleaved fiercely to emotional bonds, averring that family was defined by love and participated history, not genetics. Others couldn't move past the deception, viewing it as an insupportable violation that tainted every relationship it touched. These opposing doctrines created pressure that hovered to permanently divide the family along ideological lines. What made the situation indeed more unpredictable was the undetermined question of responsibility. The person responsible for the original deception remained a creepy presence, indeed if they weren't physically there. Their conduct had set everything in stir, yet defying that verity meant continuing injuries no bone felt ready to face. Avoidance came a managing medium, but it only allowed resentment to mold. As days turned into weeks, the emotional damage strengthened. Depression settled in still for some, manifesting as prostration, detachment, and loss of purpose. Others masked their pain with wrathfulness, lashing out at anyone who dared to challenge their interpretation of events. The house that formerly represented consanity now felt like a maze of emotional traps, where every commerce carried the threat of farther detriment. The existent at the center of the DNA disclosure began to question their place not only within the family, but in the world at large. Without the Forrester name anchoring their identity, they felt unmoored. Intentions that formerly felt attainable now sounded uncertain. Dreams erected on heritage suddenly demanded foundation. The cerebral risk of this identity extremity hovered to undue times of particular growth. At the same time, a quiet but important metamorphosis began to take shape. Stripped of hypotheticals, this existent was forced to defy who they truly were beyond a last name. The process was painful, but it carried the eventuality for tone discovery. Whether that eventuality would be realized depended on whether the family could allow space for mending rather than judgment. Cleric, observing from the fringe, began to understand that the verity he revealed was only the morning. The real challenge lay in what came next. Truth alone didn't heal injuries. In numerous cases it made them worse. Healing needed responsibility, empathy, and an amenability to accept uncomfortable realities. Whether the Forrester family was able of that remained an open question. The final consummation, maybe the most unsettling of all, was that the DNA stunner had exposed further than a single taradiddle. It had revealed a pattern of secretiveness that ran deep within the family. However, what differently had been buried? The possibility that other secrets was cast a long shadow over every commerce, icing that trust would not be fluently restored, if this verity could remain retired for so long. As the Forrester family stood on the point of endless fracture, one verity came necessary. The family they formerly knew was gone. In its place stood a broken structure, held together by habit rather than certainty. Whether they would rebuild commodity stronger and further honest, or allow the damage to destroy them fully, remained uncertain. What was clear still was that the DNA disclosure had changed everything. There was no returning to the history, no pretending the verity didn't live. The future of the Forrester family would be forged in the fate of treason, defined not by blood alone, but by the choices they made when everything they believed was taken from them. And as the dust continued to settle, one question dallied in the silence, unanswered and creepy. Was the verity worth the cost? The fate didn't bring clarity. Rather, it brought a slow, grinding reckoning that settled into every corner of the Forrester world. The original shock had faded, but what replaced it was far more sharp query. Each family member moved through their days with caution, as though one wrong step might beget what little stability remained to collapse entirely. Familiar routines felt foreign. Indeed, the simplest traditions now carried the weight of the verity, transubstantiating comfort into quiet discomfort. The emotional distance between them grew, not because love had dissolved, but because trust no longer felt safe. Every expression of care was filtered through mistrustfulness, and every moment of silence felt loaded with implied allegations. The family had always flattered itself on adaptability, yet adaptability needed consanity, and consanity had come fugitive. The DNA disclosure hadn't only altered their understanding of the history, but had poisoned their capability to imagine a future without fear. For the individual whose identity had been torn piecemeal, the struggle boosted. They began to realize that mending would not come from external confirmation or solace, but from an internal reckoning. Accepting that their worth wasn't dependent on a surname came both the hardest and most necessary assignment. Yet indeed as strength began to form beneath the pain, loneliness persisted. Belonging, formerly assumed, now felt tentative, and that query cut deeper than any public reproach ever could. Cleric remained a silent presence on the edge of the chaos, apprehensive that his part in the unraveling would no way be forgiven by everyone involved. Still, he refused to lament exposing the verity. The taradiddle had demanded a reckoning, and delaying it would only have strengthened the eventual damage. Whether the family would one day fate that distinction no longer signified. The verity was, and it demanded to be faced. As the Forrester family stood divided, one reality came clear. The destruction they faced wasn't solely the result of a DNA test, but of time spent prioritizing image over honesty. The disclosure had simply stripped down the vision. What remained was a choice: continue adhering to a broken heritage, or rebuild commodity predicated in verity, still painful that process might be. The future of the Forresters would be shaped not by blood, but by courage. Whether they held enough of it remained to be seen. Time continued to move forward, indifferent to the desolation it left in its wake. The Forrester name still carried power in public, but intimately it felt fragile, nearly concave. The family learned that survival didn't mean returning to what formerly was, but learning how to live in what remained. Each day needed trouble, restraint, and an amenability to sit with discomfort rather than escape it. The DNA disclosure had exposed further than a single taradiddle. It had revealed how fluently love could be confused with certainty, and how ruinous it was to lose both at formerly. Yet within that loss, the possibility of metamorphosis still emerged. However, they might find a way forward that was more honest than anything they had known before, if the Forresters could accept that family wasn't a fixed identity but an evolving bond. The damage could no way be cancelled, but it didn't have to define the end. Whether the family would rise from the remains or be permanently fractured would depend on choices yet to be made. In the silence left behind by Verity, the coming chapter awaited to be written.